Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. If this is your first time listening or watching a Parker's Pensées episode, yes, I know it's Pensées, but I'm an American swine, and I pronounce it like an American swine. This is a podcast where we talk all sorts of different things, and if you're into philosophy and theology, nature, life, whatever, this is a podcast for you. So I recommend you guys subscribe, leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and a comment. That would be huge. That would really help out. Today I have with me an absolute legend. I have with me Dr. Mark Sainsbury, and we're going to be talking, hopefully we're going to be focusing in on logic, paradoxes, and his work on concepts. But I've been wanting to pick this guy's brain for a long time, so I'll try and stay on topic here. Without further ado, let's just bring him in. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
You're very welcome.
So Dr. Sainsbury, or Mark, it's going to be hard for me to do that. You're a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas. You've been at Oxford. You've been all over the map. For me, the books that I've been familiar with are Paradoxes, Logical Forms, and then you sent me your book, Thinking About Things. In my head, you're like a logician, but then also you were the editor of Mind for like 10 years. Like, how do you describe yourself as a philosopher?
Well, I think really just a philosopher of language. So you can call me a logician, but I have to say I think that's doing me much too much honor. Because I think of logic as essentially a branch of mathematics. It's something I can't do. I don't have the intellectual capacity for logic construed in that sort of mathematical way. So if you wanted a sense of what logic, properly speaking, as I think of it, properly speaking is, then it's Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica in 3 volumes, 1910 to 1913. According to Russell, only read in full by 8 people in the world. The last 2, it's in 3 volumes. The last 2 volumes are practically nothing but formulae. It's purely formal. So that's sort of canonical work in logic that's directed at a philosophical question, namely whether mathematics is logic. So it's not logic done just for the sake of it. It's done with a philosophical purpose, but it's extremely technical and way beyond me. So there is a notion that people use. It's gone slightly out of fashion recently, I have to say, of philosophical logic. And philosophical logic means you don't have to do much of the technical stuff.
Yeah.
I would regard some of the things I've written as belonging to philosophical logic. So that's the study of things like truth and entailment, and paradoxes, I think, falls in the category of philosophical logic.
Okay. So maybe I could call you a philosophical logician there. Do you follow Russell and Whitehead in logicism? Would you say that math is reducible to logic then?
Well, I think I think the original logicist program has really fallen into disrepair since Gödel's incompleteness proof, because one of the hopes was that the whole of mathematics would get to be provable by being reduced to logic. So within logic, there was a clear notion of proof. And I think both Frege and Russell, the 2 great logicists, were hoping that not only would they be able to define mathematical concepts in purely logical terms, that's a project which arguably has succeeded, but they'd be able to provide proofs of mathematical truths in purely logical terms. And that's a project which has been shown to be impossible. So that part of it is down the tubes. So I just take the conventional view here that logicism has failed.
Okay.
And so it was interesting, and there was a lot to be learned from it, but it didn't achieve what its founders wanted to achieve.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That sounds right. And especially, I was just reading on Kurt Gödel earlier this year, and his appropriation of a liar paradox type move in order to demonstrate his incompleteness theorems is wild, and it's far beyond me. But before we get into too much more technical stuff here, Mark, I just wanted to find out, how'd you get into philosophy, and then how'd you decide this is what you wanted to do professionally?
Well, when I was at school, which in England means high school, more or less, I did for my specialized in history, French, and English. But I didn't really want to do any of those subjects at university. It was assumed I would go to Oxford, and quite how that got into the story. I don't remember any conscious decision. It just, the sun would come up tomorrow, and then when I left school, I would go to Oxford. So when I arrived, I had to make a choice of what degree to enroll for. So I didn't want to do any of those. But there was this degree that I hadn't actually really heard of before I arrived, PPE, Politics, Philosophy and Economics, or sometimes called modern grades. It was meant to be a general degree that would equip you to rule the empire or something. Anyway, I hadn't done any of those three subjects. I didn't even know what philosophy was. I had a vague idea what politics and economics were. So it just sounded fun, and turned out to be fun, with philosophy the most fun of the three subjects.
Yeah, well, amen to that. I follow you there, and I've also seen it as kind of a backdoor to understanding a lot of other disciplines. If you can kind of wrap your head around some of the basic philosophical concepts, then you have a shorthand, or you have an easier way getting into other mathematics and physics and other things like that. Not that it's super easy, but having some kind of philosophy has helped me learn other different disciplines.
I think philosophy, at least the way it's done in so-called tradition of analytic philosophy, the kind of philosophy that's mostly practiced in England, America, Australia, the Anglophone countries. If you can't be clear, you can't do anything.
Yeah.
If you can't organize your thoughts in a systematic way, then there's nothing you can do in the subject at all. So not all philosophy is like that, but the kind of philosophy I've done is like that. And that does give you general intellectual capacity for thinking clearly, setting out your thoughts in a reasoned and organized way, avoiding distractions, not losing your way, not losing your thread. And this is actually valuable in any subject. I mean, I wouldn't actually think that, well, maybe it helps with formal subjects like mathematics, but it also helps with everything, even history or something you might not think philosophy would be valuable for, just because it gives you this method of systematic thinking. So students often remark that their philosophy courses have helped them with their other courses. And I believe them. It seems quite natural that this would be so.
Yeah. I found it to be eminently practical. But also, I love the abstract. I love going deep into abstract concepts. That is really fun. And so some people kind of poo-poo that, but a lot of your work, your work on paradoxes, it's take up these questions that we ask maybe when we're kids, or we're first presented in Philosophy 101, Ship of Theseus kind of questions, and you go in and you give a rigorous analysis of. And so also thinking about non-existent things. Some people might just go, oh, let's not worry about that. Let's get back to, the concrete. But I love that you answer the question. You say, no, this is a question worthwhile. This can help in the whole project of human learning. So let's take this up. So I really appreciate the type of philosopher that you are. Before we get into paradox, I just want to ask a couple just random questions about logic, just to get your thoughts on it. Where, thinking of like the metaphysics of logic, is logic, you talked about its relation to mathematics, and language as well. Is there a Platonic realm where the laws of non-contradiction and bivalence, those kind of things exist, or what do we make of logic itself?
That's a rather deep question. I mean, humans make it up, but they don't make it up just freely. I mean, it's no good saying, well, my logic contains some law of contradiction or something.
Yeah.
Well, the words came out of my mouth, but then I remembered there is a famous logician with followers who does actually have a logic, has constructed a logic in which some contradictions are true, namely Graham Priest.
Yeah.
And he's very distinguished, and his views on this matter are taken very seriously by anyone who considers logic. So your question might be, does that mean he's misread what's going on in the Platonic universe, or that we have misread what's going on in the Platonic universe? So I don't think it would be helpful to answer yes to those questions. I think it would be more helpful to say, well, what's the logic for? And will it serve its purpose? So it's not. So one of the things, for example, one of the points that Graham makes is that the database may contain a contradiction. You collect your data. There's absolutely tons of it. You don't notice there's a contradiction. You don't want your database, and in classical logic, from a contradiction, everything follows.
Yeah.
You don't want your
explosion.
Yeah. Explode into just having all propositions, so that a paraconsistent logic which is what Priest calls a logic which allows for true contradictions and which doesn't accept this, as you say, the law called explosion, has actual practical applications. Well, if you're building a database, and that's the kind of logic you want, you shouldn't be thinking, does this correspond to how things are in a Platonic abstract universe? Yeah. You should just be thinking, does this do the job I want? So I think I'd rather refocus the question on utility rather than the matching of abstract metaphysical structures.
Yeah, that's helpful. So the system can contain a contradiction, but that doesn't necessarily mean that now you've changed this Platonic realm, or that there is a Platonic realm, but that, it's for utility, using it for different purposes. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Well, so I wanted to jump in on paradoxes and just ask you, what made you decide to take up this project of paradoxes?
Well, I do actually remember. I was having a conversation with a fellow philosopher, a fellow graduate student, actually. It was long ago in Oxford. His name is Roger Fellows. This is maybe the first time I've had the opportunity to acknowledge his influence. He said, wouldn't paradoxes be a good way to introduce people to philosophy?
Yes.
Because after all, they grab your attention, and yet they involve a lot of quite difficult philosophical stuff. And that thought just reverberated for a while, and eventually I thought, well, I think I'm ready now to turn this idea into something concrete. And so that was the idea. That was the plan behind the book. That was the thinking, that it would be a way to introduce people to philosophy, because the paradoxes sort of tend to grab one's attention, and then before you know where you are, you get interested in arguing about them, and then you're doing philosophy.
Yeah. I had the same intuition before I read Paradoxes. I was reading Russell's Problems of Philosophy, and I thought, introducing students to philosophy through the problems sounds like a great idea for the same reasons you just said, because it grabs them. Once you get past thinking it's pedantic, you go, oh wait, actually I'm not sure about this, let me think. And then you can introduce them to epistemology and metaphysics, and you just take different problems. And then I found most of the most interesting problems were paradoxes. And then I read your book and saw that's what you were doing, and you had all these great questions that you stuff in there and say, hey, think for yourself really quick before you go on to read the answer I give. What do you think? How do you answer this? And I thought that's just the perfect way to teach philosophy. And so I was really appreciative of that. And I used this book in when I was co-teaching an undergrad class in philosophy. So it's been really, really fruitful for me to use your work here.
Yeah.
Well, and I thought maybe you talk about a scale from 1 to 10, I believe, of difficulties. And you just, I don't know that that's scientific. You just say, let's give a scale of 1 to 10. And you say some are easier and some are harder. And this book, I believe, starts with the easier ones and then moves to the hardest. Is that right?
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
And so I thought maybe we could just cover a couple of them, and we could do a podcast on each one of these. So for the listeners know, we're not going to be able to cover all of his thoughts on each one of these. Each one, that would take forever. But Mark, can you help us with, so I thought I picked out easy one as the Sicilian Barber Paradox, and then a medium, the Racetrack Paradox, and then the hard, the Liar Paradox, which we have to be careful with so we don't go insane. But can you just introduce us? What's the Barber Paradox?
So the question is there a barber who shaves all and only those people who do not shave themselves? And the thought is, or the question that raises is, well, who shaves the barber? Because he's meant to shave anyone who doesn't shave himself. So if he doesn't shave himself, then he does shave himself. But he's meant not to shave anybody who shaves himself. So if he does shave himself, he doesn't shave himself. So there's actually a contradiction there. So what we've got is something that doesn't on its face sound contradictory. No, I was exploring some villages in Sicily, and it's amazing. Even these tiny villages have a barber's shop. And one of these barber shops, I found a barber who shaves all and only those people who don't shave themselves, and that's why he was there. Shave the people who don't shave themselves, and only to shave those people. So it doesn't sound as if I've said anything contradictory.
Right. Mm-hmm.
When you come to figure it out, you realize there's actually a contradiction there. But it's not a deep paradox in a way, because we're happy to say, oh no, there's no such barber. You made a mistake.
Yeah.
As far as the villages go, he shaves all and only those who don't shave themselves. But I mean, as far as the villagers apart from himself go, he shaves. But you can't actually make it universal, because he's bound to be an exception. And there's no deep problem there. We think, fine, okay, there's the barber I described doesn't exist. There couldn't be a barber who shaved all those who don't shave themselves. So that's why it's a low level or an easy paragraph. I give it 0 or 1 as its degree of hardness.
Okay.
But we get to by the time we get to the racetrack, we're into serious difficulties.
Yeah. Right. Well, I don't remember. I want to associate that with Russell. Does that come from Russell, the Barber Paradox, or?
He almost certainly mentions it, but I think it goes back much, much further.
Okay.
A lot of these paradoxes go back to before the Christian era.
Sure.
To Aristotle, or before them, because after all, one of the most famous paradoxes was I don't know, some hundreds, at least 100 years before Plato. So he's firmly pre-Socratic, I think.
Yes, Okay.
So I would think there's no Barber's paradox there, but something structurally similar.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we can just say, hey, look, there's no barber that does that. He has to exempt himself. That's not that hard, because we can just pause it. We can demonstrate it, because it's contradictory. There is no barber. It doesn't affect our life. But then we get into the racetrack problem, and this one's a little bit trickier, a little bit more difficult to just slough off. So can you lay out the racetrack paradox for us?
So the racetrack has a beginning point and an end point. Now, to get to the end point, you have to get halfway to the end point. But once you've got halfway to the end point, you've got another task lying ahead, which is to get to the halfway point between your original halfway point and the end point. Mm-hmm. And it looks if then you've got an infinite series of going to halfway points, but none of these halfway points is the end point itself, because it's only halfway to the end point. Right. From however far along, there's still halfway to go between where you are and the end point. So you never get to the end point. Mm-hmm. So this is something we can't just say, oh yeah, you come think about it. We never do get to the end point. You can't do the same thing as you did for the barber and say, right. Oh, there's no such barber. What you have to do is to think harder. And what you have to think harder about is the relationship between an infinite series like the one we constructed, half of this, half of what results, half of that, and the physical reality of space. Mm-hmm. And that's not so easy. That's actually quite difficult. And the general question is, how does physical space map onto the abstract mathematics that we bring to bear here? Doesn't sound anything very super elevated in the way of mathematics. We're just doing half of a distance.
Right.
But you're doing it again and again. And so the notion of infinity is creeping in here. And that's the source of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does get. I love that you brought in the difference between space and mathematics there. And for some listening, you might go, well, yeah, again, we're getting kind of airy fairy, but this is really important if we want to think about mathematics, and if mathematics maps onto the world, which it seems it does. But then we have this difficulty here where it looks like it may not. So, Mark, how do we solve this racetrack paradox?
Well. We have to think a bit about infinity, and that's one thing. And then, as you say, we have to think about the relationship between mathematical descriptions and physical descriptions. So I'll just say one thing about each of those aspects.
Mm-hmm.
So about infinity, many people, even people who've had reasonably sophisticated education, find it puzzling that there are as many even numbers as there are numbers altogether.
Right.
And it's a very natural reaction to say, but hold on, if you've only got the even numbers, you've left out all the odd numbers. So you can't have as many as if you'd had the odd numbers in. Well, we know that that's not the right reaction, but it is a natural reaction. It is a natural reaction to think that if you've left some things out, you've got fewer than if you hadn't left them out. And that seems almost like something that couldn't be doubted. But actually, in the case of infinity, you have to doubt it. So that's one of the issues, and what you've got with the racetrack is an infinite series. And our intuitions about infinity can mislead us. It's the first point. And then the second point is about how you map sort of mathematical notions onto the physical world. In the book, I thought it was fairly simple observations. You just have a line, a horizontal line. Think of it as corresponding to the racetrack if you want it. And let's call the left-hand point A and the right-hand point B. And then you draw a vertical line at some arbitrary position. Let's say that the vertical line crosses AB at point X. So, and that's a point, a mathematical point. Yeah. So it doesn't occupy, it's a position in space, but it doesn't actually fill space. That's the thinking behind it. This is the attempt to apply mathematical notions to the physical world. So then you've got the question, well, does X lie in the segment A to X? Or does it lie in the segment X to B? Does it lie in the left-hand segment or the right-hand segment? And there's no definitive answer to that question. You just have to make a choice. So the problem is this. If it lies in the left-hand segment, so A to X forms a segment, then what you've got left is a line with no starting point, with no first point. And in physical space, that makes no sense. But that's what the mathematics tell you, because between any, you've got density here. Between any 2 points, mathematically, you've got a third. And so the question is whether physical space can usefully be understood in those terms. Yeah. The answer is probably not. But then quite what you do next is a more difficult problem. Yeah. That's where the problem arises, really, between any two, it's the density, I think it's sometimes called, between any two mathematical points, between any two numbers, in the real numbers, you've got another number that is bigger than the one and smaller than the other.
Yeah.
You can't really do that for points in space.
Yeah. So is the answer then that if you're thinking about this problem mathematically, then you're thinking about it the wrong way to apply that to our concept of space? So obviously you can run a racetrack, but maybe mathematically it seems like you wouldn't be able to.
I think perhaps the way to put it is the mathematical way of thinking doesn't help you understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Because if you think of it as this infinite series of halfway points, then the end point is not a member of that series.
Right. You never get to it.
So if you thought, well, the way to understand running is in this mathematical way, you're halving the distance and halving the distance and halving the distance, then you'd understand running in such a way that you could never get to your destination. That is not a great way to understand running. So, so don't. understand it that way. Don't think of it that way.
Yeah. So okay. So Mark, from crossing from going from point A to B, if I'm walking or if I'm running on a racetrack, would you tell people that you're crossing an actual infinite, or would you just say don't
I
think
think
of it?
that's the reason you can say. I mean, here I may just move my hand across your screen. Yes, I mean, if you're into points, then there's only one answer to how many points I move my hand through, namely an infinite.
Yeah.
Of course,
Okay.
I also move my hand through just 2 feet.
Yes.
Once you start thinking mathematically, of course, there are an infinite number of sub-regions, indeed, within your 2-foot region.
Yeah.
So, yes, in some sense, you've done something infinite, amazing, so easy. To attain the infinite,
Yeah.
just move your hand.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really helpful, and reading your section on this was helpful because it kind of helps you look out for an equivocation between physical space and mathematical conception of space, and you say, look, I'm crossing an infinite, or I have crossed an infinite, and or it's impossible to move, and yet we're moving, and so well, yeah, but you've changed terms, you've changed from physical to mathematical space now back to physical, and that's why it looks so insane to us. Does that seem right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. All right, great. All right, so we're making some headway here, and now we're getting to the hard problem, the hardest problem, the liar paradox, and this is especially dangerous because it caused at least the premature death of Philetus of Kos or Kos.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe we could couch it a particular way for the listeners, as all podcasters are always liars, because I'm a podcaster and I'm telling you that.
Right. So if what you say is true, then it's false. And we need it to be the other way. I can't quite see that right at the moment. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the simplest version is this very sentence is not true.
Mm-hmm.
And a reason like this. Supposing it is true, since it says that it's not true, it's not true. If it's not true, then since it says that it's not true, then it is true.
Yeah.
So if it's true, it's not true. And if it's not true, it is true. So this is a contradiction. It's a very deep problem, I think. I don't think I can give you anything like a solution.
Yeah.
Even if I had many hours of podcasting. Because I don't really know how to do it. But I think I know sort of where the problem lies, and that is that not every sentence that makes sense can be evaluated as true or false.
Yeah.
And for some reason that it's hard to specify properly, this very sentence is not true is one of those. It's one of those sentences that you can't evaluate for truth or falsehood. So, of course, there are plenty of sentences like command that you can't evaluate for truth or falsehood. So, this is not a completely wild notion.
Yeah.
But there are also sentences which can't be evaluated for truth or falsehood because they lack some sort of intelligibility condition.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chomsky gave a famous example which he thought couldn't be evaluated for truth or falsehood, namely green ideas sleep furiously together.
Yeah.
Personally, I don't think that's a great example of what we're talking about, because I think it's false that green ideas sleep furiously together. Green ideas don't do anything because there aren't any green ideas. But anyway, that's just a personal opinion. It's easy enough to come up with sentences that are nonsensical. Pos brillig and the slithy toes, the jar and the gimbal in the wave. So it sort of sounds like a sentence, but you can't. The question, is it true or false? You should just say, that's a question that doesn't arise. Yeah. And then for the liar, what you need is a nice account of how sentences work and how truth works, which enables you to treat this sentence is not true, like "'twas brillig and slithy toes," i.e., as a sentence with respect to which you don't have what's necessary to make evaluating it for truth or falsehood appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. So one worry that I've had in thinking through this myself, so I really like the work of Bos van Frossen on this, and he appropriates Peter Strawson's notion of presupposition, and he says,
Right.
well, this is just a failure of presupposition, and so yeah, but in appropriating the Strawsonian presupposition, he is forced, maybe he's not forced, but he does give up bivalence and says, well, then yeah, not every sentence is true or false. Do we have to give up bivalence if we say that the liar paradox, that sentence is neither true nor false? Or you said commands are neither true nor false. So
Yeah, giving up bivalence is not such a big deal if it
okay.
just means saying the sentence, there are sentences which are neither true nor false. So bivalence would be problematic if it's formulated more on these lines. There are some fully intelligible, non-defective sentences which are neither true nor false.
Okay.
And if you lack a presupposition, then you're not a non-defective sentence. You're a defective sentence.
Yes.
That's why you're neither true nor false. So it's not really giving up bivalence in the way that an intuitionist, say, would be pleased with.
Yeah.
Intuitionists would want you to give up bivalence, not with respect to some defective sentence, but with respect to some perfectly decent, ordinary sentence.
Yeah. So thinking through this a little bit more, is there no propositional content to the liar paradox? And maybe
that's the idea, yeah.
Okay. So
there seems
so then,
really, yeah.
right, yeah, it's a faux proposition or something. And so yeah, it gives the appearance of having propositional content, but it doesn't. And thus we could still have bivalence concerning propositions, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Okay. All right.
So, using that terminology, then the shape of the solution to the paradox is that the paradoxical sentences don't express propositions.
Yeah.
But then the hard work comes for giving some theory of the conditions under which sentences do or do not express propositions.
Right.
And I'm not pretending to have anything about that.
Yeah, me neither. Okay. All right. So all that to say, I recommend Mark's book here. It's called Paradoxes, and it's in its 3rd edition. Is there any goal to make a 4th? Is that on the horizon at all, or?
I haven't heard anything from.
Okay.
Cambridge just suggested each of the subsequent, the 2nd and 3rd editions. That was their idea, and they haven't proposed it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I wanted to finish our conversation with paradoxes, or on paradoxes, with the Ship of Theseus, because it's came back up into pop culture through, I don't know how much philosophers are aware of pop culture and Disney Plus shows, but there's a show, WandaVision. Have you heard of WandaVision at all?
I have not.
Okay. It's based off of it's based off a superhero comic book, and the paradox comes up where this robot AI is talking with himself, and he's talking about the Ship of Theseus. And so everyone online is talking about the Ship of Theseus. And I thought, the guy who wrote the book on paradoxes, we gotta at least ask him. So can you lay out the Ship of Theseus paradox for us?
So it goes like this. Theseus had a ship, and he was a commercial sailor, so he took people on trips, and he transported cargo and so on, and he was wheeling around the Mediterranean. And during the course of these activities, his ship got damaged in various ways, and the planks rotted and things. So one by one, he replaced the damaged parts. But unbeknownst to him, some avid collector, the sort of person who's very interested in the original this and the original that, collected the parts of the ship. And eventually, he had a complete ship, because every part of the ship had been replaced at one time or another. We could imagine this taking 20 or 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mediterranean's pretty tough on ships. It does a lot of damage. Yeah. So what the collector then did was to reassemble the parts that he had. So now it looks as if we've got 2 candidates for being the Ship of Theseus. But intuitively, there ought to be only one ship. So we ought to make a decision and say that one is the real ship and the other is not. So what we've got is Theseus. Theseus went on sailing his ship, so there was a continuity of purpose and function. But there wasn't a complete continuity of composing material. And the collector had continuity of composing material, but no continuity of function.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got two different ways in which one can think of the ship of Theseus as having survived. Yeah. It survived in Theseus's hands as a functional entity. It's still the same, still doing the same job. Survived in the collector's hands as a purely material entity. So you can make this into a paradox by saying that on the one hand, the original ship is the ship that Theseus is now sailing. And also the original ship is the ship that's in the collector's museum.
Yeah.
But the ship in the collector's museum is distinct from the ship that Theseus is now sailing. So you've got a contravention of what's called the transitivity of identity. You've got two distinct things, the collector's ship and Theseus's ship. They're distinct because one's in the museum and the other's still plying the waters of the Mediterranean, being claimed both to be identical, both of them to be identical.
Yeah.
The original ship of Theseus, but two things can't be identical to one. So you've got that's the way to present it as a paradox, I think.
Yeah. Well, before we try to answer it, where does this lie in your opinion on the 1 to 10 difficulty scale?
Well, I'm not quite sure about that. I mean, I personally find it quite easy to give up the idea that you've got identity here.
Uh-huh.
But I think that's rather that may be rather a personal view, and other people may find it harder to give up the idea you've got identity. Certainly, if you look at the recent history of the discussions by people like David Wiggins and other distinguished writers, I think Harold Noonan wrote about this too. I mean, lots of people have written about it. The idea that I personally favour has not, I think, not received much attention. So I regard it as a case of fission, and fission is sort of puzzling. But on the other hand, we know it's something we have to live with, because if you plant a daffodil bulb, it undergoes fission.
Yeah.
You plant a bulb in November, and you come back in January, and where there was one, there are now two. But it's not that the original bulb has died.
Yeah.
There's no corpse.
I think that happens with twins, with certain types of twins as well.
Oh, in the I think you're right. In the division, in the cellular division that occurs in the egg. Yeah, I think you're right. Okay. So it's not an uncommon process in nature, and also in non-nature too. Because if you think of a road that divides into two, and so you just think of a Y, a letter Y that represents the roads, and there's a sense of one road becomes two, so we're sort of. I mean, fission is quite a common phenomenon, and it is puzzling, but I think we just have to lump it. That's what we have to say about. We should compare the ship of Theseus to a daffodil bulb, in my view.
Okay.
So that's the way to come to terms with it. But as I say, I don't think that's the favoured. I don't think that's the most anything like the most common way in the literature.
Well, yeah, and since it hasn't been treated, as you said, it hasn't been treated all that systematically. Maybe this is the next work. Daffodils and Theseus or something.
That's right.
Yeah. So I guess we could say, the boat has fissioned off into two, and so you just say Theseus, ship of Theseus A and ship of Theseus B. You say, well, which one is the ship of Theseus? And you say, well, depends on what you mean by that. Do you mean the one that's continuous with the ship and it's a meteorological whole that's taken on new planks, or do you mean the historical one that he used on that one mission or that one trip?
That indeed would be one way to put it. I would prefer, I mean, depending who my question was, I would prefer being a bit starchier and saying this is a case in which one thing has become two.
Okay.
So it doesn't really make much sense. I mean, I don't really disagree with what you said. I mean, that was your answer would be a more helpful and explanatory answer. But I think my answer was sort of more technically correct.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with your question because we've got two things here, but they were one thing at one point.
Yeah. Okay, that is different. I have to think about that. Yeah, I like that. It's intriguing. Yeah, you got to write the book now. Um, well, actually, before we go on, I wanted to talk about. I think this will lead into your work on concepts. So, is our concept of the ship of Theseus, is that vague, or is the ship itself a vague object, or maybe both? Can you talk about vagueness
Those are all
here?
difficult, those are all difficult questions, and I'm not sure what I think about most of them. So, of course, I do think there are some concepts that are vague.
Mm-hmm.
Concept tool is a vague concept. So it's not that I'm against there being vagueness in concepts. So that is one approach that's been taken to the ship of Theseus. It's to say that the concept of identity is vague. And that's generated a huge literature. People have discussed that pro and con.
Yeah.
One could do a nice sort of collection of papers actually on people who've discussed that issue. So that is one option. I'm not very enthusiastic about it myself because I prefer this Fission story where you don't need to invoke the vagueness of identity, which is a very controversial issue.
Right.
But it certainly is it's out there as something that deserves to be thought about.
Yeah. Well, man, that could work in your favor even more so that we don't have to get into the morass of the vagueness problems if we just look at your fission answer. So, I want to motivate it even more. This is great. If you guys are listening, send them an email and give them that book proposal. Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
But nobody should think that fission is a completely straightforward notion. One thing comes to, whoa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, okay, so I wanted to move on as we finish up here into your most recent book, Thinking About Things, and talking about. I love thinking about concepts. It's in my mind right now. Well, yeah, it's in my mind because it's a concept as well. But and non-existent things,
Mm-hmm.
and I yeah, I want to get in. So before we jump in, you said that your whole in the beginning of your book, you said the whole book is kind of predicated on or inherent to your project is a representational theory of mind. And I just wondered, how important is that theory if we wanted to appropriate your work? Must one adhere to a representational theory of mind, or can you be like a functionalist, whether that's different, or behavioralist, or dualist, or some other stripe?
Oh, yeah, I think so. By representationist, I was just really picking up the idea as it was used in Fodor, years ago, 30,
Okay.
40 years ago, which doesn't actually commit you, by the way, to views about dualism, cyclism, or functionalism, or behaviorism. It's pretty non-committal, I think, in those respects. So it's just the view that thinking is essentially representing.
Yeah.
That's what it does. And maybe it would be perhaps more controversial if one added that perceiving is also representing. That's something that perhaps it's not universally accepted. But really all I need for the book is that thinking is representing. I think so I do take that for granted. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That works well. So your book, in your book, you're talking about how to think about things, and you ask, how can we think about things that do not exist? And you have this amazing quote. And again, I should mention you're a fun writer too. Yes, we're talking about abstract things, but it's fun because you just have a really great writing style. So I appreciate it. But and here's a demonstration. There being no things we are thinking about does not mean we are not thinking about things. And it's we'll talk about paradox. What the? So I thought. Right. So maybe we could talk about this puzzle about unicorns.
Yeah.
Can you just lay out the puzzle about unicorns for us?
Yeah, well, I love unicorns. So we can think about unicorns. Everyone agrees with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might think, if we're thinking about unicorns, we're thinking about something. And if we're thinking about something, doesn't that mean there's something we're thinking about? So what could the something be if we're thinking about unicorns? So it could only be unicorns. So it looks if we got proof of the existence of unicorns.
Yeah.
We're thinking about unicorns, we're thinking about something. So there are unicorns we're thinking about. Now, there has to be something has to have gone wrong because there aren't any unicorns. So the project of the book, in a way, was just to explain what went wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting because if you were to take that thought and say, okay, I have a concept of unicorn, and so there must be, is that called quantifying over? Did we just quantify over unicorns? Is that the right terminology?
That is exactly the right terminology. So what occurred was a quantification. If we're using technical language,
Yep. Jump
it's
on in.
into an opaque position.
Okay.
So when you say I'm thinking about unicorns, that's what people call an opaque position. Perhaps I won't try and say why it's called that, but quantifying into it is a bit weird, as the example shows, because one can think about unicorns without there being any unicorns one's thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And there are unicorns I'm thinking about quantifies into the opaque position, but I'm thinking about unicorns doesn't quantify into an opaque position. The quantification is within the opaque. If there is quantification, I'm thinking about some unicorns. The quantification is then within the opaque position.
Yeah.
So that sort of technical distinction in semantics, I guess, is very important to getting your metaphysics right.
Yeah.
Because if you don't get your semantics right, you'll find yourself committed to there being unicorns, which seems to me you shouldn't be committed to.
Yeah, and all sorts of other wild stuff, and it has implications too for, if you're a proponent of like an Anselmian ontological argument or something like that. That it has it's got its fingers in a lot of different pies here. Just a thought that popped up. Can you have a concept of like a square circle? So that's a different type of non-existent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You've just put that concept on the table, or I should say, in the podcast.
Okay.
All of your listeners are now exercising the concept of a square circle.
Okay. And so, so you say that representations are not what we they're what we think with, and they're not what we think about. So we don't like think about representations. They're the tools, I think you say.
Yeah.
Okay. So, when I have this concept of unicorn, concepts are representations for you, and I think you're right there.
Yeah.
So, what is it representing? Because
Nothing.
Okay.
Nothing is one answer, and unicorns is another.
Okay.
But they're both true.
Yeah, because it is like no thing. It doesn't exist. We're not quantifying over. Where does that concept of unicorn, sorry to go back to the Platonic realm type stuff, but where does that concept of unicorn exist? Is that just instantiated in everyone who has the concept, or is it somewhere else?
Well, yeah, it's not really located. So the concept is an abstract thing which is realized in thinkers. They exploit or exercise the concept. So you put the concept in the third realm if you want, or Plato's. What do people call it? The Platoplasm. If you want to locate the concept itself. But what matters is human beings exercising the concept, and those are actual events in the world.
Yeah. Okay. And so, I have a hard time with. Sorry, I do think about the Platosphere or whatever a lot. Because if I just made up a concept, if you and I worked together here and we made up a concept, we made it up, we wouldn't be like, I guess they'd have to, a really hardcore Platonist would have to say we didn't make it up, we discovered it, or we picked it out of the realm. And so I just have a hard time, concept formation, I guess.
Well, I think there are real questions about concept formation, but don't depend on whether you're a Platonist or not about the metaphysical nature of concepts. So you might ask, how do we acquire the concept of a unicorn?
Mm-hmm.
And the standard answer has been that it's a complex concept in which you put together a notion for unity in the uni bit, and a notion for a horn in the corn bit. You put those concepts together, and that fashions the concept, the complex concept unicorn. So it was part of the project in the book to say that account won't work. Certainly won't work in all cases. And then the question is, well, what's the right account? And I'm not sure if there's anything all that systematic to say. It seems to me very clear that we can just manufacture concepts sort of to order. I wonder what's round the corner. You're approaching a blank corner, you can't see what's round the corner. Well, the imagination can at that point come up with all sorts of things. So, it could be something boring like a car, or something more interesting like a dragon, or something yet thought of. At that point, you can fashion a concept. And I don't think that fashioning a concept is just this putting together bits that it has often been assumed to be. So the old empiricist tradition was that there were the simple ideas, and then you made bundles of the simple ideas. And that's where complex ideas come from. And I think that's an inadequate view of the non-simple ideas. So there's quite a lot about that towards the end of the book, in fact, in the last chapter, trying to make it plausible that we can create concepts without actually knowing whether they answer to anything, or even knowing that they don't answer to anything, which is what goes on in fiction. Some forms of fiction, or even just producing a fictional name, you know that name does not answer to anything. In the real world, of course, you pretend in the fiction that it's answering something, but you know quite well that it doesn't in fact answer. In fact, it doesn't answer. It's only in fiction that it answers. So there are a lot of interesting questions here about how concepts are formed, and whether you have to tell a different story for the formation of concepts which don't have reference. And so I try to provide a unified story in which concept formation does not, is the same sort of thing, whether the concept has a reference or not. So forming a concept isn't just copying something that you've perceived. It's a different kind of intellectual activity.
Yeah, and so the display theory is at the heart of your book. Can you? I know it's an entire book, right? So people should go and buy that book as well. So I know we can't go into all the details. Can you just briefly sketch your display theory?
Sure. It's a theory about how we describe other people's mental states, what's going on when we describe other people's mental states. And the key idea is a sort of simple idea. What we do is to put their mental states on display. So you tell me something, you say it's a lovely day today, which actually is in Austin. And I say, well, what Parker told me was it's a lovely day. Now, what is that it was a lovely day doing? Well, I claim I'm not saying it's a lovely day. I'm saying that you said it was a lovely day. I'm not asserting that. That's not part of what I myself am saying. What I'm doing is putting on display what you're saying. I'm putting it on display so that someone can figure out, end up knowing what you were saying. So this means that I'm not committed to it being true. Parker said it doesn't follow that. I'm sorry, it doesn't in general follow that it's true.
Right.
But it doesn't follow that it's true. So I'm not committed to the truth. I'm committed to the truth of your saying it, without being committed to the truth of what you say. And likewise, I'm not committed to the concepts that I put on display having any reference, because you believe in creatures from outer space or something, and I don't. But I say, Parker said that a creature from outer space visited him last night. I'm not committed to there being any such things, because I'm not saying it in my own right. It's as if I was saying, let me tell you what Parker did this morning. There are creatures from outer space. So it's like it's as if I was going through a little bit of play acting to reveal what you did. So that's the claim. That's the thought behind display theory. It's a thought about how we report the mental states of others.
Yeah.
We report them by displaying them.
Yeah, that's helpful. And so the display theory is like a third person, reported speech or reported thought type thing. And so, yeah, again, we're not quantifying over, in a reported speech thing. Yeah, I still have like such a hard time with like the ontology of like fictional characters. So like Samwise Gamgee from Lord of the Rings. I have a concept of him, and I assume you have a concept of him. That concept doesn't refer to anything, does it?
No.
Okay, but yet it kind of still does, because like we could both talk about his attributes and stuff.
That's right. We can exploit the concept and we can form meaningful thoughts. And
Yeah.
of course, we can report the thoughts of others using the concept. Now, it's often assumed that for that to be possible, the concept does have to refer to something. And so it's what makes people think that there really, really are fictional characters. I mean, that when you've said everything that exists in reality, you haven't, or in the familiar reality, you haven't said everything that exists because you haven't said the fiction, you haven't added in the fictional people.
Right.
So I reject that metaphysical view. I think there's just the real world.
Yeah.
Of course, I think there are lots of fictions, lots of stories. And I think that in the stories, there are all sorts of people who don't exist in the real world. But when I say in the story, there are these people, it doesn't mean that there are these people.
Yeah.
It just means that there's a story. That's the only reality that you get out of a sentence that begins in the story or according to the fiction, such and such. You're just told how a fiction is. You're not told how reality is.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So there's not so like possible world semantics doesn't tell us about when we say close possible worlds. That's just it's a intuition pump, or those are concepts, but they're not actual. They don't have to be actual in order for us to use them as tools for philosophy.
I believe that. Yeah, I believe what we just said. A related point is that some people have tried to characterize fictional characters as possibilia, as possible objects. And some people think that there really are possible objects that are not actual.
Right.
So David Lewis is the famous exponent of a metaphysics of that kind. So I do, in fact, beat up on theories of that kind. Not just because I don't like the metaphysics, but because I don't think they're adequate to the nature of fiction and how we think about fiction.
Yeah.
So I give those reasons in a different book, which we haven't mentioned, called Fiction and Fictionalism.
Okay.
So I do consider, I call it possibilism, as an account of the metaphysical character of fictional characters. It is a perfectly good theory, and it's been held by no less a person than David Lewis. So obviously something that has to be taken seriously. But I do argue that it doesn't actually work out for sort of detailed reasons. Even if you, I don't much care for the metaphysics, but even if you make no fuss about that, there are detailed reasons why it's hard to think of fictional characters as possibilia.
Yeah, I'll have to grab that book, because that I'm very interested in what you're saying there, and I think just as a practical note, it's kind of weird to it kind of diminishes the role of the author, the fictional author, and saying, well, they didn't create Harry Potter, they picked out a possible world. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that on my view, you do full justice to creativity.
Yeah.
And one of the points I make actually in the book is that on the possible worlds view, you're a discoverer, not a creator as an author. You scan the worlds and you decide what would be interesting, and you pick that out. It seems completely the wrong picture of how creativity works in fiction.
Yeah. Okay. So one last question here as we close out. Do you have a particular concept or a particular theory of concept formation, like simplicator? So like do we come with innate concepts built in, or do they emerge? Like, is it a historical emergence, or like an abstractionism? Have you given much thought to how we get our first concepts?
Well, I certainly should have done. I don't know if I've given enough thought to it. I don't see any advantage in innatism. I don't see how that's going to explain anything.
Yeah.
Because if you think the concepts are innate, you still have to think that there are situations which trigger their activation. But instead of thinking of it as triggering the activation of an innate concept, you can just think of it as the formation
Right.
of
Yeah.
a non-innate concept. So I think just structurally, innatism about concepts is completely unhelpful.
Yeah.
The details, of course, about how concepts formed are very tricky. They're open to psychological investigation.
Mm.
So, as you know, recent psychologists have spent a lot of time trying to tell us the conditions under which infants form, the concept of an object and concept of a stable object and so on. So it's all very interesting. From the philosophical point of view, I think one thing that I do think is worth pointing out is that one way to acquire a concept is from other people.
Yeah.
And I think we do that just by immersion in our linguistic community.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we need definitions or anything. I think definitions are wildly overrated. We just pick up concepts from others.
Yeah.
And so even for proper names, and how do we learn proper names? We just hear other people using them, and we latch onto them. And so I think that that's an important method of concept formation. Of course, doesn't really answer your question how the first concept arise. Clearly, perception is playing a part.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, something about our innate structure, what we notice in perception, is also playing a part. Yeah. But I don't have all that much to say about further details of how that works out.
Yeah. Well, I think I totally agree with you on that. And I've been reading a lot on Donald Davidson's triangulation argument, and I've seen you mentioned Davidson a lot, and it's what you said, the social structure that you have a mother or a father, whoever the first teacher is, and they say, look, Parker, this is a table. Can you say table? And you start to form, and you're forming this concept from the linguistic community. But he does argue that you need full-blown, that might not be his language, but maybe one of his students, full-blown linguistic triangulation, because mere ostension doesn't give you the precision needed to pick out the aspect of the concept. And so it seems hard for me then to think about how we ever formed our first concepts before language was used.
Well, it must be something to do to imagine a pre-linguistic infant. There must be, the innate faculties must be playing a role here, because there's some things notice and some things they don't notice very much. Their attention is drawn, say, to moving objects, to colored objects, and so on. Yeah. So we know that we can figure out what's grabbing their attention, and then they'll start to recognize. Let's say there can be behavioral evidence that they're seeing something as the same as something they've encountered before. The mother is obviously one such thing, and strangers don't necessarily go down well.
That's right.
It's differ a bit, but often strangers lead to problems. And so we know that they are capable of recognition, for example. Well, recognition is consists, or one way to recognize is simply to reapply a concept that's already in your possession.
Yeah.
And so even if it's a little overstated to regard infants as doing exactly that right from the word go, one can see that recognition capacity is a forerunner of a conceptual capacity in which the recognition actually involves the application of the same concept.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Well, Mark, this has been huge. Thanks so much for letting me cover such a broad swath of your work. It's been really fun. I know the audience is going to love it. And you're welcome on any time to talk any of this more, or that next book on the ship of Theseus that you're going to have to do. Thanks so much for all your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. It's been really fun talking to you. It's very stimulating.
Awesome. All right. Well, we could talk about this more, and someday maybe we will. But for now, it's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.